Okay, I'm starting this recording again. I forgot to turn off the ringer on my phone, and so the phone started ringing, and it was my boss. So I felt that I should answer it, so I did. And so I'm starting this again. Hope you had a nice holiday. Hope that your loved ones and your family are healthy. People are wearing masks and um, showing that respect for others with social distancing. So I did put extra credit on Canvas, and have been getting some of those in. And I did neglect to say how you were to get that to me, but you can just email your responses, and that will be just fine. No problem. So you can do that. I'm going to move this up just a little bit. There we go. And I will say that I was just really bewildered by the third exam and in the grades on the third exam. I just really don't know what happened. I don't understand what more I can do to give you the time and the date for the test and why people miss the exam. I want you to use your executive function, that frontal lobe that helps keep you organized when I talk about the exam and you get the date and you get the time. I fully expect that you're going to write that down someplace. And I don't know what more I can do to help you with that. I also, as I said, I was bewildered by those grades. And I think if you're like me, I've shut down a bit, and maybe that's it. I know that if you every week will get onto Canvas and look at the lecture, don't wait until a weekend, because one weekend becomes another weekend, and the third weekend, and the fourth weekend. And please don't do that. Stay up with the lectures. I know it's hard given the situation and how we have to disseminate information, but it will serve you well if you stay up with the lectures. Now, that extra credit is on Canvas. It's due to me on Friday, and then it goes away. So I will not allow anybody to still turn it in after Friday. So please adhere to the dates, the due dates. Our next lecture will include Chapter 8 and Chapter 9, and we're going to skip the first part of Chapter 8. It is the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The first 7 pages in Chapter 8. The chapter is called Development of Speech Sounds and Cultural Variations. The first 7 pages talk more about articulation, sound development. It's more speech pathology related. Speech pathology majors will get this information in other classes. I don't think that it is quite as important, quite as vital for the LED and special ed students. So and some of this I've already talked about in some of the lectures. So I'm bypassing that because we have a lot to get through. I'm starting the lecture with PowerPoint page 141, Chapter 8, Dialect. Do you see that? There you go. Dialect. That's what I'm starting with. Now, dialect, according to Wolfram and Christian, is defined as any given variety of language that's shared by a group of speakers. So if you have a group of speakers who are in the hills of Kentucky You will have a certain type of language that will be spoken as compared to up east in Boston. You will have a different type of language than what was spoken in Kentucky. It is regional, it is interesting, it is based on the environment, it's based on rituals and history of a certain area. So the dialect, again, is any given variety of a language shared by a group of speakers. And it has developed, that dialect has developed over time. It can be developed due to politics, due to business, due to social structure, due to education, and it can be different for different levels of socioeconomic groups. People who live in the same area tend to speak the same way, the same variety of language. It, the speech, the language and speech that is spoken in Kentucky is not right, not wrong, or any more wrong or right than what is spoken in Boston. It happens to reflect the region, and that's all. It doesn't mean that it's more right or it's more wrong. It depends on the area and the influences of that area. Um, Standard dialect. We're going to talk now about the difference of vernacular dialect and standard dialect. Standard dialect is spoken by people of high status. They may be in higher paying jobs. They may hold higher paying uh, influence in banking, economics, politics, politicians. And there's a social power about this certain group of people. That's the standard dialect. And there's no right or wrong or absolute standard English, but you will find that there is a different type of dialect within that group. Vernacular dialect is what I call the difference that we see in grammar, phonology, semantics, vocabulary, pragmatics, and I sort of look at that as the blue collar worker. Vernacular dialect is another term for a non-standard dialect. So the standard dialect is one that is influenced by politics, a more elite group, somebody who holds a high paying job. Somebody of influence is your standard dialect. The vernacular is another term for a non standard dialect. So that's why I say I think that the standard dialect is more of your white collar worker, your white collar group, where the vernacular dialect is maybe more in relationship to the blue collar worker. But you will see that there are differences in grammar and the semantics and the vocabulary and the pragmatics. There are differences in those 5 language areas that we've already studied earlier in the semester. So we know too that accent and dialect are different. Accent is characteristics of speech or variations in pronunciation. So that accent is the difference in the pronunciation. The dialect is differences in language as well as speech. So your accent, for example, up east, if you remember from history, you may have seen videos of the Kennedy family, and they're famous for a variety of reasons. And they have a very thick New England accent. And you might hear something like, go park the car. They do funny things with that final consonant. Go park the car. Well, that's not go park the car. We roll our R's a little bit more, and they are cutting them off and changing and distorting that R. So accent is just the difference in speech, of pronunciation. That's the accent. The dialect, I'm sorry, gets into differences in language as well as speech. So the dialect is a broader term because it includes more. And it's not, we talked earlier about um, reading and writing many times being influenced more by the environment than genetics. Genetics, DNA, is more influential in speaking than it is in reading and writing. The environment, the influence of the environment that the child lives in. And it's the same way here. Dialect is not a product of biology, it's a product of the culture that you live in. And we're going to talk about four different cultures. We're going to talk about African American English, Hispanic, Hispanic English, Asian English, and Native American English. Now, the Native American English also includes the Alaskan Indians. It's an American Indians, and so it's a different type of, I think, dialect than what we would consider on a, oh, if you were asked the question, give me an example of a dialect, you might say Hispanic English, or you might say African American English. But I think that the Native American English is one that we don't typically say first. The African American English by far is the most studied and probably the least understood and the most stereotypic impressions that we have about it, and that it's English that is incorrect, and none of that is true. African American English is also known as a black dialect, black English, Ebonics. It's been called and labeled many different things over the course of years. And I think it's sometimes reflective of what's going on in the world, in politics, and research and studies, and sort of the title of the times. We come up with certain ways to describe situations, and that gets carried on. But it is probably the most studied and the least understood. We think that the way people speak, and it may not just be African American English speakers, but that it's wrong, it's incorrect, they're ignorant, they're uneducated, they dropped out of school, but it is a reflection of the culture that they're living in at the time. Now, we may not understand what they're saying, and sometimes we don't. And it's not just with African American English, it can also be with Hispanic, with Asian, and with the Native Americans. Um, but probably we have maybe more contact with the African American English population, certainly than we would have of Native Americans, depending on where you live. But we know that, and I've had that experience too. We know that there are times when we speak to someone and the sentence structure, the syntax is different. The phonology is different. The meaning is lost in the translation of what does that mean? What does that phrase, what does that expression mean? And I've had experienced difficulty myself with a certain dialect, but it doesn't mean that the dialect that that person is using is wrong and they're ignorant. It doesn't mean that at all. And we have to get over that thought process. The African American English, the long history of the transformation of that language goes back to influence from the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French. There were merchants who had items that they wanted to sell, things they were making. They may have been food items, maybe they weren't, but they had items that they wanted to sell because they knew that the African Americans, or the Africans, not Americans yet, the Africans had items that they needed, and vice versa. It was going to be a win-win situation. And so the dialect that was spoken was a long time in evolving, and it was influenced by the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and the words that were exchanged, the language that they could not speak, but they were highly motivated to sell what they had and to buy what somebody else had. The Creolist theory states that African American English is a hybrid that's derived from several African languages, and it mentions the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the French, along with the English. When speakers of these various languages interacted, they developed a common language called Pidgin. Now, the word that one of the African traders used for money was different than what the Portuguese traders used for money, the word that they spoke. So maybe they came up with some word approximation that only the Portuguese were using with the African traders. That's Pidgin, how they took the influence from French, from the Portuguese, from the English, and they began to understand each other. So their history is very, very rich, and that influence is very, very rich. And it was called Pidgin. Now, it's a non-dominant language, and it accepts just a few key words, usually in relationship to business and trade, from a dominant language. It starts out and is pretty informal. You may, as a merchant, you may go to the same merchant that you traded with the time before, and you go back to them because you were able to understand each other and you continued to use that word. Maybe you use gestures, but you were able to communicate, and it was successful for both of you. When Pidgin becomes the primary language of a group, it's called Creole. So you go from languages that are separate, Portuguese, Dutch, French, English, and the African language. And then you come together because you have things to sell, they have things they want to buy, vice versa. And you're getting bits and pieces of the language that you're using during business time or you're trading. And so you're getting this non-dominant language, you're into Pidgin, and then all of a sudden over time, this language becomes a primary language of a group, and that's where you get the Creole. Now we know down in New Orleans, it's Bourbon Street, it's highly influenced by the French, that French architecture, those beautiful homes. You can see the influence very heavily there. And there's I think, a large Creole population there. And they have a certain way that they speak to each other, and they change the way they speak to somebody who doesn't know Creole. And we do that all the time, this code switching. If I'm going to speak to someone, if I'm traveling and I'm in another country and I hear another person speaking English and they appear to be an American, oh, I may go over and talk to them and just be so pleased to be able to talk to someone who knows my language. Um, and you just get kind of lost. You it's almost frightening when you're not able to communicate and speak a language that with everyone that you're around. You feel very vulnerable that way. And so as we as we move through a certain community, we'll hear, excuse me, we'll hear people talk to each other about anything. And if it's Creole, you'll hear words that you may not understand. You may think, oh, wow, they talk really fast. Or what did he say? He was talking about something and it sounded really interesting, but I couldn't understand the thing he said. Then let's say that this was a business person and maybe it's a restaurant and you went into their restaurant and the person changes the dialect and you now all of a sudden can understand what they're saying. This is that code switching, whereas when I speak to someone who knows my language, I speak a certain way. When I speak to somebody who doesn't know my language, I'm going to speak another way. So we have to switch the codes to meet the need and to meet the situation. Um, Hispanic English doesn't have that long history. They uh, are primarily of one language, and that is Spanish. The historical influence is just really based on that single language of Spanish. But not all forms of Spanish are the same. You will have influences of Spanish uh, from different areas in which they speak Spanish, but you're not getting that influence of the Portuguese and the Dutch and the French. Spanish is used in many, many different languages. Also, you'll find in other countries where Spanish is spoken or another language is spoken, English is also spoken. So countries around the world are learning English, excuse me, but they're learning variations depending on where we are living and where we come from. I remember a student in one of my classes one time, she went to Puerto Vallarta to the restaurant. And if you're not from Muncie and you haven't been to Puerto Vallarta, you're missing a real treat if you like Mexican food because it is outstanding. It is delicious, it's reasonably priced, and you get large quantities of food. And oh my gosh, you can just really have a really nice time. There are 3 Puerto Vallarta restaurants in town, actually. Um, but she was there. I do not think that um, she was Hispanic. I think she was Caucasian, and but she maybe was minoring in Spanish or something, and she wanted a straw. And the term she knew for straw is what she used. And the waiter, most of those waiters and waitresses are Hispanic, and they looked at her in a very strange way. And she said, you know, and she repeated the word. And the waiter had no idea what she was talking about. And then she pointed to the straw. Oh, and then he explained how they say straw. So you see, they all are speaking Spanish, but it depends on the region and the area that you come from. but you don't have that rich history of that language. We also know that the languages have strong, deep cultural roots, that there are certain days of the year that are very important to them. There are certain rituals that they may do at a christening or a birthday or at a funeral or at a wedding. Um, they they may still be a little bit different depending on the region. We know that storytelling is very um, historically, I think it is very important for cultures. They talk about how they grew up, their family, their traditions, their food, the love of family, what the men do to go out and hunt, working in a garden, what the women do. Uh, it is based on very strong, strong cultural beliefs. And the storytelling definitely is highly valued. We know that there is a strong relationship between English and Spanish. English has 24 consonants and 12 vowels, whereas Spanish contains 18 consonants and only 5 vowels. And we know that some of the words that are spoken in English or that are spoken in Spanish sound very much like the word that's used in the other language. Now, in Spanish, I'm not very good. I know agua, I know just a few hola. I know just a few words, enough that I could maybe engage someone of that culture in a conversation because I am interested, but I just haven't taken the time to learn it. But we know that there is some pronunciations that are very similar between the standard English and the Hispanic English. Now, I know that I went to a Mexican restaurant and I said I wanted polo. And the guy's looking at me and everybody at the table is laughing. Well, I wanted chicken and it's pollo or something like that. And so I can't say it phonetically, can I? Because I really bombed on that one. But and the word order is many times different. Um, I think in Spanish you might say something like yellow is the car. We would say the car is yellow. So there is a difference in word order. The Asian English, we know we have a large population who have immigrated to the United States over the last 40 years. And just think about the size of Asia. Just think about the size, and that will tell you how many different dialects you may find and variations because it is staggering. It really is staggering. I talked to a family from Vietnam and before I went to Thailand, and because listening to the family speak to each other in Vietnamese, they use lots of vowels. Well, I I can't, and I try, and when I leave, I try and recreate that sound, and I certainly can't do it. But I asked the mother, I told her I was going to Thailand, and I said, are the languages similar? And she said, oh no, I wouldn't be able to speak to them at all. So even though it's an Asian island, that doesn't mean that they can speak to each other. But just the vast size, I think, dictates the large number of immigrants who have come to this country. They just come from so many different places. Um, the most common spoken language in the Asian population is Chinese, but it's certainly not the only language. I remember when my daughter and son-in-law were looking at, I think it was an elementary program for my grandson to go to. And one school, they taught Mandarin as their second language, and there was another one that spoke Chinese. And Spanish, I think, is pretty common. And actually, the school that he ended up going to, Spanish was the language that they spoke. So in most countries, you have multiple languages. You would have more multiple languages depending on the size of the country. So English is a work in progress. Many other countries use it. When I went to Thailand, actually, I went there to teach conversational English. And the students that I worked with were college age, and one was working on a PhD. But they're much more immature and socially not as advanced. And they had learned some English in their studies, but they'd never spoken to anybody who spoke English. So it was really interesting. We laughed a lot because we both made mistakes along the way. And there were many times I would have to gesture, almost using sign language in order to help supplement what it was I was trying to say. So it was fun. English, and think about slang, idioms. Think about in texting, because everybody has electronics all over the world. Think about the language of texting, and how our words change, memes, emojis in the words. It's amazing. It's an evolving language. Nearly 2 million individuals in the U.S. Identify as Native Americans, and this is a U.S. Bureau of Census piece of information, and it's really quite old. Well, 1990. I need to, that came from the textbook, but I need to update some of the data that's in that textbook. And you'll find Native Americans living in every state in the United States. Now, you're going to find more in the Southwest than you will probably up close to Canada, but they do have Native Americans in every country or every state. There are over 500 distinctive tribes, and they have their own governing body. They have their own language, their own culture, and as you know, they're very ingrained into the earth and the sky and nature, and a lot of words that we have come from the Native Americans as well, and their origin is in the Native American culture. Um, Now, one thing that I will say about the Native Americans, I worry sometimes about the type of education that their kiddos are getting. They live on reservations, they govern themselves. I don't think anybody living on an Indian reservation is getting rich. However, we have heard rumors and stories about Indians who own, operate, manage whatever the casinos. But we also know, due to research, that there is a higher incidence of fetal alcohol syndrome in Native American children, and that there is a very high incidence of alcohol within that population. I, I'm not really sure why, unless um, they feel that they're misunderstood, um, that they've lost a lot of their land, and I think that's probably a topic that could be debated for hours. But they do live in tribes and they do govern themselves. There are some Native Americans live on 278 reservations in 209 Alaskan Native villages. Now, many of the villages are in very remote areas, very remote. And what I will say about that is, as a result of living in remote areas in Alaska, think about health care, think about getting medical attention if you're sick and you have a heavy snowfall, um, getting to school could also be a problem if transportation is a problem due to the weather and snow and the elements. Um, I know I was watching something on TV. It was some kind of a documentary, and there was this. Well, they don't in this remote area. They don't have neighborhoods, so you may have a house here, and then you may not have another house 5 miles away or something. But there was a train that went by. The family in the house would make a list of the supplies that they needed. Then they would go and stand on this platform right by the railroad tracks, and the train would stop at a certain time and would only stay there for a brief period of time for you to give them the list of supplies that you needed, and then they were gone. And they didn't wait. They didn't wait. If you weren't there and it was time for them to move on, they moved on. Then they would come back the next week and bring the supplies. That's how you got what you needed, because they didn't have the transportation to get through the snow and ice. So therefore, how are the children getting to school? How are they getting to the doctor if you suspect an ear infection? And by the way, they have the highest incidence of otitis media, along with fetal alcohol syndrome too. So getting to school, getting to the doctor. What if you can't get to the train station, the platform, and you miss them? Now you may go 2 weeks without food. So you can see that it's a very hard, I don't know that I want to say a hard life, because maybe they don't feel like it's a hard life, but it isn't an easy, cushy life. If you don't have anything to eat, you go to McDonald's or you go to the grocery store or you call somebody and they go for you. Even in really bad weather, people are out and about. But in some of these remote areas, it's very difficult to do that. What if mom is pregnant and she's getting ready to have that baby, or the baby comes early? So, what if you're out of fuel and it's really cold? So you see, in some of those remote areas, it's tough for our kiddos to get the stimulation, the language stimulation, that they need. Um, I would suspect those parents have to be really creative. Also, getting to your job. Uh, Maybe you can't get there to your job. Um, but maybe you only work a few months out of the year because of the weather. And if you know that there are certain months, then you stock up. You have to be resourceful, and you definitely have to think ahead. I think too that the tradition of the Native Americans and their beliefs and aren't always respected. Um, and some people don't understand their philosophy of the mountains and the and nature and the sky and all of that. And certainly I haven't researched it, but they do deserve the respect of what they believe. Regional dialects. I wanted to give you some words from different parts of the United States. Let's see. Okay, in Colorado, they call a brace for cutting firewood a buck. That's a regional dialect. It's the word, it's the language that they're using. We don't call anything that we use for cutting firewood a buck. I don't, and maybe some of you do who've come from Colorado. A pig sticker. Now that comes from Connecticut, and it is a sled with a pointed front. A pig sticker. Now, I would suspect in Connecticut they could get a lot of snow, and that sled has a pointed tip, and that helps it to get through the snow. I've seen that on some large trains up in Alaska who have to travel on the rails through snow, and they'll have a different some kind of an adapted front to it, and that's a pig sticker. So if you're on a sled with a pointed front, that you're on a pig sticker. Delaware, a sneak is a tennis shoe. Okay, that one I get. Sneakers. In the District of Columbia, a slug. Well, I call myself a slug on weekends when it's Dirty Hair Day and I'm not doing anything and I'm watching TV and I'm a slug. It's a day that I'm not very productive. But a slug is a hitchhiking commuter in the District of Columbia. In Georgia, if you hear the word burk, that means vomit. Mm, mm-mm. In Hawaii, a hoo-hoo means that you're angry. Oh, I'm very hoo-hoo because I thought you were going to burk. I'm very angry because I thought you were going to vomit. Now this one, in Illinois, a scrambled dinner is a potluck supper. Makes sense, but Illinois is not that far from Indiana. In Iowa, kitten ball is a softball. Okay, it's a softball. It's not a hard ball. Okay, let's see if I can say this word correctly. In Kansas, a doodinkus, D-O-O-D-I-N-K-U-S. Doodinkus is an unspecified object in Kansas. Let me do just a couple more here. In Kentucky, a riddy bob is a seesaw. In Maine, putty around means to be idle. When I go home in the evening because my husband is retired, I'll say, what'd you do today? And he says, I just putzed around. Oh, that's similar to putty around. In Michigan, not too far from us, a sewing needle is called a dragonfly. I don't know. In Missouri, a hall tree. Now, I knew this one. Growing up, we had a hall tree. It's a clothes rack. And sometimes the hall tree was by the front door, and people who came in would hang their coats on the hall tree. I bet some of you others have heard the term hall tree as well. So those are just some words that are from other states, popular there as part of their dialect. Regional dialects are very difficult to separate from a social dialect or a regional dialect. We know that it, again, depends on who's living there, how long you've been there, what part of the culture you were influenced by. Let's see, I've got a couple more pages, and that will take care of chapter 8 for us. Our dialects constantly evolve, and that's because of slang and things such as emojis and memes. And I heard my granddaughter, she's 16, and she was talking about somebody at school, and she used a word, and the other granddaughter went, oh, you didn't say that. And it had something to do with something that they shouldn't have been talking about. And I had never heard it. I'm so out of the loop. I'm such a nerdy grandma. Um, Regional dialects are characterized by differences in all components of language. The vocabulary is affected the most, the language. Okay, let's see. I think that's really, see if there's anything over here. No. I think the next lecture, and it's been about 45 minutes, the next lecture will start with chapter 9, and it's speech and language disorders in the home, school, and in the community. That will be the next one. And then if we get through this and there's enough time, I will add some supplemental information that is relative to you as a teacher, whether it's regular education, special education, or a speech pathologist, some interesting information that will help you. Again, please stay up with these lectures. I will tell you that the extra credit, there will be questions on the final regarding the extra credit project. That article is disturbing, but it certainly touched my heart, and I hope it impacted you as well, because it shows you what can happen. An environmentally deprived brain can certainly be impacted in a negative way. And within this article, we know. So I'm going to sign off right now. Have a good evening. It is, what time is it? It is 3:11, Monday, November 30th. And I'm back in the office and working and hitting the ground running. So I will talk to you soon. Bye.